We won't want to be there when it happens. Dr. Billings, going for a run. The Grand Hotel. See Eleanor. Don't go. Finish Part 2. I don't think we'll want to be there when it happens, said Bowden, his eyes tired and his face sad, because there's no way we'll change anything. That's a bullshit way to go, said Victor viciously. Bowden raised his palms in supplication. You want to see him crucified? You go ahead and go. I don't want to watch. I didn't go when my family put our dog down, and I'm not going to go see this. It's the same thing. Swart nodded his agreement with Bowden. Slade was lying flat on his back under a bench, his eyes shut. He wasn't sleeping. You act like it's already a done deal, he said. It is, said Swart. He sounded exhausted. Coach, when we had arrived that cool fall Monday morning, had been nowhere to be found. It was like him to be a little late, but only a little. Soon we began searching. Coach wasn't in his office, curled up on his ratty couch. He hadn't been in the wrestling room, asleep on the rubbery floor. Our concern grew when the school principal, a quiet, scholarly man called Dr. Billings, came clicking into our musty locker room in his maple-colored wingtips and gray suit. He wore round wire-rimmed glasses and had a ring of silver hair that went around the back of his head from just over one ear to the other. He wore a bow tie. He removed his glasses before he spoke to us in a calm, quiet voice. Your coach, he said quietly with a trace of a southern accent, has been suspended indefinitely. A substitute coach, he went on over our gasps, our obvious confusion and anger, will be selected, and you will meet said substitute coach tomorrow afternoon. He put his glasses back on. He looked at Swart, whom he seemed to know. Do you have a practice scheduled for tomorrow morning, Devon? Swart nodded. Then that practice is canceled as well. What's going to happen to our coach? Victor asked. What did he do wrong? Dr. Billings had already turned to leave. He did, however, turn and dignify Victor's question with an answer. There will be a school board meeting tonight to determine exactly what is to be done concerning Mr. Vidstein's future employment at Penns Gap High School. As far as what he did wrong, he sighed. His eyes seemed tired. I would imagine all that will come out at the meeting. Dr. Billings removed a handkerchief from his front pants pocket. He seemed about to blow his nose, but then put it back without using it. I got the impression he didn't like having to talk to us. To be frank, I think you ought to prepare yourselves to run for a new coach at sectionals this year, and in the years to come for those of you not graduating. I'm sorry. Then he turned and left, a sandy echo coming from his leather-soled shoes as he walked away. We'd been reeling since he'd left, fighting about what to do next. Are we going to go on a run this morning? Asked Popeye in a rare moment of silence. Shut up, Leonardo whispered. Popeye shrugged. What? He asked. Suddenly, Slade sat up, knocking over the bench he'd been lying beneath. He hadn't moved once since Dr. Billings' announcement. Popeye's right, he said. Let's go for a run. He gathered himself and stood, and in less than 15 minutes we were all standing in the lobby of the infamous Grand Hotel. The place was worse than I'd heard, and I'd heard it was bad. It had been a railroad stop on the way up to Chicago in years long past. There must have even been something romantic and actually grand about it way back then. The marble floor must have been impressive once upon a time. But the floor was now cracked and filthy, the cracks packed with a black, oily, sticky substance. There was a vintage cigarette machine with fake brass pulls under a tiny TV bolted to the wall. The little TV had a wire cage around it, as if anyone would ever want to steal it. The marble check-in counter was covered with plated metal blinds that were pulled down. A battered piece of cardboard had the words, See Eleanor to check in, room 301, scratched out in blue ink. The lobby smelled of stale tobacco smoke. The two skeletal chairs sitting before the television looked small and insufficient in the vast lobby. The place was lonely and forlorn, and I felt vulnerable standing there in my running shorts and long-sleeve t-shirt, like some kind of bad luck and morbidity of the place might rub off on me. This place must have more than 100 rooms, said Swart, as he took in the 12-foot-high ceilings. It's big. 3 floors, added Victor. And about 3 people staying here total, added Bowden. How are we going to find him? Asked Swart. Victor started down a gloomy hallway without looking back to see if we were following. We're going to knock, he said. And with that, he began shouting, Coach! Over and over as he banged on one door after the next. How many people did you wake up? Asked Coach as we sat on the curb in front of the hotel, the sun just coming up, the sky before us red and gray. It had been too small and dingy in his room, too sad to stay in there to talk. I don't know how many we woke up, Bowden said, but you were the only one who answered the door. Coach, sitting on the curb, wore a pair of worn jeans and a college sweatshirt. Indiana, his alma mater, where he'd been a member of a national champion 4x800 team back in better days. Although the morning was cold and damp, he wore only a pair of dirty white socks, his feet stretched out onto the street in front of him. Coach smiled. He put his arm around Slade. You boys are all right in my book, he said. His smile disappeared. Just so's you know how I feel, though, you oughtn't to be there, at the meeting tonight. He glanced around at us all. If that's what you're thinking, I mean that you ought to go. A garbage truck rounded the corner, grimy and hulking, like some kind of monster out of the Terminator. 2 men, black silhouettes against the red sky, hung off the back. Popeye waved at them. They didn't wave back. That's what we heard, said Victor as the garbage truck disappeared back into the gloom with a roar. He was glaring at Bowden. That we shouldn't be there. We'll be there, said Slade. I promise, added Victor. Coach smiled again. He stared at the empty street in front of him. He seemed to be searching for something to say. I'll be there too, said Bowden, his eyes hard on Victor. If that's what you want, Coach. Me too, said Swart quietly. Coach glanced up at all of them in turn. You know it won't change anything. We know. You're getting fired, said Swart, matter-of-factly. There's no doubt about that. Dr. Billings said as much 20 minutes ago. Victor rose as if to kick Swart as he sat there on the curb, but Coach reeled him in by the tail of his oversized No. 1 sweatshirt. Swart's right as usual, said Coach as Victor sat back down. He's a touch insensitive sometimes, but he's right. It's a done deal. We'll go anyway, said Victor. We'll make it hard for them, at least. We'll make them feel like the assholes they are. It was quiet for a few seconds. A street lamp tinged off, and a dishwater color of gray bled up from the horizon. The red began to fade to pink. I know you're behind me, Coach finally said, breaking the silence. He sighed and glanced around at all of us. But I'd really rather none of you went. Victor began to protest, but Coach raised his hands for silence. Victor shut his mouth. I appreciate that you want to support me, but when you run a monkey up a tree, you're going to see its ass. Popeye's eyes squinted in confusion. Swart put his finger to his lips to keep him from talking. Coach took off his glasses and wiped his sleeve across his eyes. I surely appreciate that you boys want to go, but there's going to be nothing you can say that'll change anything. He sighed. I'm going to look real bad. Real bad. If they even agree to let you say anything, they'll just end up asking you questions that'll sound awful when you answer them, and then you'll feel bad when you shouldn't. Besides, your season ain't over. Don't think just because they're canning me, you can give up on me. Silence filled the street until Slade spoke up. Finish, he said, his eyes hard on Coach. Finish the job. That's right, said Coach, a real smile on his face. You gotta finish, right, Slade? Slade nodded. You gotta finish, he repeated. He looked around at all of us. Finish, he said, and there was nearly a snarl on his face. It was the first time I felt like he was actually our captain. I'd like to say we all banded together that night and stormed the school board meeting and gave such passionate and heartfelt testimony that Coach kept his job. I'd like to say we told Coach we loved him, and everyone there cried, even Dr. Billings, at the heartfelt emotions swirling through the room. I'd love to tell about Slade threatening the entire school board, doing something crazy and full of good intentions. But none of that happened. As is sometimes the case, your best teachers and coaches, your best people, the unusual ones, the ones that make a difference, sound like lunatics and frauds to those not familiar with them. The gems of experience they provide sometimes comes off as wrong-headed or worse in the retelling. You have to know the whole story for the anecdote to work, and there's never time enough to tell the whole story. So that night, Coach was fired, and none of us were there, because that was the way he wanted it. We cared about him enough to do what he asked of us, whether we agreed with him or not. And we, at least us bluebirds, were still just kids. What could we do? That's what we told ourselves, at least. I see now that the protective harbor of childhood allowed us bluebirds to sit by and not say a word while Coach was given his death sentence. And that's the only thing I truly regret about that season. Although we all had things we could have said on his behalf, at least things we should have said to him, we felt no urge and no duty to do so. That's the luxury of being a child. But the story doesn't end there. As Coach said to Slade, and Slade said to all of us that morning, we sat on the sidewalk outside the Grand Hotel while the sun rose, we still had to finish.